Today I shall speak on India's role in non-aligned movement, which was the basis of the India's foreign policy. At first we are to discuss the background of the non-alignment, policy of non-alignment as India adopted as the main pillar of its foreign policy. There were two aspects, global and internal, in formulating India's foreign policy. India had her independence in August 1947, and that was the period of Cold War. By that time, Cold War was in a very high tide, and the perspective of the Indian foreign policy and the non-aligned movement should be understood on the perspective of the Cold War politics. In fact, the entire world had been divided into two armed camps during the Cold War. One was under the leadership of United States of America and other Western powers, and the socialist countries remained under the leadership of Soviet Union. The essence of non-alignment was not to remain under the control of any of the military blocs. Internal background of non-alignment also cannot be ignored, because India had always a anti-imperialist strand in her freedom struggle. India and the Indian statesmen after independence wanted to integrate the Indian policy with the colonial people of the entire world, particularly the Afro-Asian nations who remained under the colonial, racial and imperial dominance of the Western powers. So, on that background and perspective, the Indian rulers, particularly the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, wanted to adopt the policy of non-alignment as the very basis of its foreign policy. The architect of the non-aligned movement, or NAM, was India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. In an article entitled Changing World, written in 1963, published in Foreign Affairs, Nehru said that non-alignment means policy of friendship toward all nations uncompromised by adherence to any military pact. Nehru emphatically added that essentially non-alignment is freedom of action, which is part of the Indian independence. Nehru's effort was to establish India's leadership over the newly independent Afro-Asian countries that could potentially form a third bloc. We are to clarify the main objectives of the non-alignment. In fact, Indian Foreign Office had three objectives in adopting the policy of non-alignment. First, the issue of security had got priority. The Indian policymakers, particularly the first Prime Minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, thought that if India gets involved in any military bloc, Indian security and independence may be endangered. So, Nehru wanted to avoid any turmoil or danger by not involving India into the camp of any superpower. In that sense, policy of non-alignment was molded by Indian interest of self-defense. India also thought that the question of independence was very important, because if India did not include her in any of the armed camps, either led by the Soviet Union or by the United States of America, India could independently formulate its foreign policy, and no big power could pressurize India in that respect. And India thought that the policy of non-alignment would be a path for great Asian resurgence and to make a third area. The third area means which would remain neutral, and that would help the other non-aligned nations, including India, to negotiate things, and any military danger can be avoided through arbitration and negotiation. Nehru, Indian independence was a part of wider Asian resurgence. A remarkable initiative was taken by Nehru that even before independence, Nehru called the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi in January 1947. Then in January 1949, again the Asian Relations Conference was convened. In that conference, Mahatma Gandhi also spoke, and Mahatma Gandhi appealed to the Asian countries to conquer West with love and truth. In spite of presence of Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru stole the show. Many discovered in Nehru the most authentic voice of resurgent Asia. By this time, Nehru became one of the most important proponents of non-aligned movement. The second conference, which took place in January 1949, was not restricted to Asian countries only. Even the countries like Australia, New Zealand and Egypt and Ethiopia from Africa participated in the conference. In June 1954, the Prime Minister of People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai, visited India. Zhou Enlai made an agreement with India, and both Nehru and Zhou Enlai agreed to stand in favor of peace and maintaining a very favorable bilateral relationship between the two countries on the basis of Panchshil or peaceful coexistence. On 22nd December, the Yugoslav President Marshal Tito visited India, and in a joint statement both Tito and Nehru accorded their full faith on the principles of peace and non-alignment. The Colombo Conference, held in 1954, saw the real beginning of the non-aligned movement. The Colombo Conference was in fact an Asian leaders' conference in which the term non-alignment was first and primarily used. The representative of the participating countries in Colombo again met in Bandung just 1 year later, that is in April 1955. In the town of Bandung, it was a very successful conference, and the Bandung Conference undoubtedly advanced the non-aligned movement to a remarkable success. Bandung Conference was a remarkable step for the advancement of the non-aligned movement. It emphasized on specific points: fundamental human rights, respect to UNO Charter, maintenance of sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Asian and African nations, equal rights for all races and nationalities, and above all, settlement of any international dispute through negotiations without issuing any force. Furthermore, Bandung also condemned racial segregation in South Africa and upheld the rights of the Arabs in Palestine. While pursuing the policy of non-alignment, Jawaharlal Nehru found useful support from few contemporary statesmen, particularly President Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nkrumah of Ghana, and President Tito of Yugoslavia. At the initiative of these leaders, the Cairo Conference was held in Egypt from 5 to 12 June 1961. The Cairo Conference supported the ideals of non-alignment, world peace and national liberation struggle in several Afro-Asian countries. A few months after the Cairo Conference, the first summit conference of the non-aligned nations took place in the capital of Yugoslavia, that is Belgrade. It took place on 1st September 1961. At Belgrade Conference, Nehru, along with President Nasser of Egypt and Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, gave a call for nuclear disarmament. In 3 or 4 important international issues, the Indian government became involved, and all the issues were acid tests for India's practice of non-alignment. At first, we have to discuss India's role in the Korean War. In the year 1950, there was a bitter conflict between South Korea and North Korea. In South Korea, there was a pro-United States of America government, and in North Korea, there was a communist government. When the conflict got a bitter stage, the United States of America immediately interfered in the Korean politics and wanted to help South Korea for fighting the North Korean army. In fact, under the leadership of General MacArthur, an UN force was formed, and the motive of the UN force under the leadership of MacArthur of USA to fight the North Korean army. At that time, People's Republic of China reacted sharply, and it sent People's Liberation Army to Korea to fight against the South Korean forces. The situation in international level became very complicated, and it became a tense affair in the Far East. At that time, India took a very proper role to mediate the problem. When the United Nations wanted to condemn People's Republic of China and adopted a resolution condemning China as an aggressor, the Indian Foreign Office strictly opposed it. Furthermore, India said that an amicable settlement should be made. Ultimately, a ceasefire was completed in June 1953, and the Indian General Thimaiya became the chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commissions when a crisis and problem cropped up regarding the repatriation of the war prisoners of both USA and China. The Egyptian President Abdel Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal in Egypt on 26 July 1956. So long, the Suez Canal was under private company, French and British company, but after the declaration of nationalization by Abdel Nasser, both the governments of France and Great Britain were very much aggrieved with Egypt. At that time, Israel was also very much critical of the activities of Abdel Nasser. In November, Israel invaded Egypt without any rhyme or reason, and soon after, France and England joined Israel in invading Egypt. But Indian Foreign Office immediately criticized the arbitrary attack against Egypt by the big powers as well as by Israel. Jawaharlal Nehru appealed to all the nations to put an end to the war. At that time, Soviet Russia had issued an ultimatum to France and England: if they did not stop the war and stop the aggression, then the international situation will become worse. In that sense, the Suez crisis came to an end on 5th November 1956, when both England and France as well as Israel had withdrawn their army. Though Canada played the most important role of a mediator, still Indian Foreign Office also played a very positive role in reducing the tension related to Suez crisis. Now we are to deal with India's role in Hungarian crisis. In the same year, that is in 1956, there was a severe crisis which cropped up in Hungary. Hungary's Communist Party leader Imre Nagy, he gave call for a free and fair election in Hungary and also demanded an open democratic society. But This was not liked by Soviet Union. Within a few days, Soviet tanks entered Hungary and Imre Nagy, along with his associate Paul Maleter, was arrested and later executed. The pro-Soviet leader Janos Kadar was made the president of Hungary. During the time of Hungarian crisis, Nehru at first called the Hungarian incident very tragic, but when a UNO resolution was adopted condemning the activities of Soviet Union, the Indian Foreign Office opposed it. At that time, the famous socialist leader Jayaprakash Narayan criticized Jawaharlal Nehru and the India's external office, calling that India had played a double standard and it was a double dealing on part of India's foreign office in dealing with Suez crisis and Hungarian crisis. Now, we will take a very brief note on India's role in the Congo crisis that took place in 1961. In 1961, there was a civil war in Congo which disturbed and endangered the territorial integrity of the newly independent African nation. Jawaharlal Nehru insisted both Soviet Union and United States of America to take proper steps in Congo, and ultimately at the insistence of Jawaharlal Nehru, the UN forces entered Congo. Territorial integrity of Congo had been restored. According to many, Nehru's role, particularly India's role in the Congo crisis, was really a commendable one, and it was a real test of India's success in non-aligned movement. However, there are some criticism against the non-alignment policy of non-alignment and non-aligned movement. Particularly, the proponents of balance of power have criticized the non-aligned policy of non-alignment and particularly questioned the efficacy and effectiveness of non-alignment in the wake of an aggressive war by any imperialist power. But Nehru replied, if anybody's independence is threatened, if peace is endangered, we cannot sit idle. We have to take definite side and resist the imperialist aggression by any power. Moreover, many criticize that after independence, the India government heavily depended on foreign assistance, foreign financial assistance. Both Soviet Union and United States of America helped India to reconstruct the nation and reconstruct the economy of the newly independent nation. Particularly with the Soviet help, many heavy industries had been built, and with American help, many problems could be avoided by the Indian ruling class. But despite such criticism, one should say that the non-alignment was the very basis of Indian foreign policy, and not only that, ultimately under the able leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, it was turned into a movement of the developing neutral nations throughout the world. Thank you.